The Operator Log, Episode 7, What We Observe, The Case for the Studio, Why Founder-Led Models Struggle with Autonomy. The structural advantages of autonomous architecture are too expensive to rebuild from scratch with every new company. Last week, we established that the incumbent cannot eliminate its coordination tax without dismantling the organization built around it. Legacy liability is the structural condition of a business too dependent on human coordination to rebuild itself from within. Today, we examine a different version of the same trap, one that applies not to the incumbent trying to reform, but to the founder trying to build autonomous from the start. The founder-led model carries its own structural constraint. It is not legacy liability. It is infrastructure drag. The 12 to 18 months of foundational engineering every autonomous build must absorb before the core revenue loop can run. Every founder who attempts this alone solves those problems once, in isolation, under time pressure, with no reference architecture to build from. The studio model exists because autonomy is too difficult to rebuild from scratch with every new company. The structural advantages of autonomous architecture are too expensive to reconstruct in isolation. And the case for the studio is not philosophical. It is arithmetical. This is the operator log. The conventional defense of the founder-led model is optionality. A founder can pivot, adapt, and respond to market signals in ways that a studio with pre-built infrastructure cannot. They are not constrained by prior architectural decisions made for a different deployment. They can follow the market wherever it leads. This is a genuine advantage. In a speculative market, where the demand is uncertain, the product needs to find its shape through iteration, and the primary risk is whether the market exists at all. Arco does not operate in speculative markets. As we established in episode 5, we enter only proven markets with structural demand and identifiable incumbents. In that context, optionality is not an asset. It is the absence of conviction. We know the market. We know the cost structure of the incumbent. We know the architecture required to deliver the same output at a fraction of the cost. A founder who enters the same market with full optionality is not more agile. They are starting from a weaker position, with more uncertainty than the situation requires. In the classic venture capital model, investors bet on the founder. They look for the operator who can navigate market uncertainty through judgment, will, and the ability to make the right call when the data is incomplete. This is a high-variance strategy by design. Most bets fail, and the ones that return do so at multiples large enough to cover the portfolio. It is the rational approach when market uncertainty is the primary variable. At Arco, we remove that variance by betting on the track rather than the jockey. Because we only enter proven markets with validated demand, we do not need a founder to discover the revenue. We need an engineering system that can capture it reliably, repeatedly, and at a cost structure the incumbent cannot match. The market selection criteria from episode 5 and the studio model are not separate decisions. They are the same decision approached from two angles. The structural cost of the founder-led model becomes visible in the first 12 to 18 months of an autonomous build. Before the core revenue loop can run, every autonomous business requires the same foundational engineering, a data architecture accessible to agents rather than humans, an orchestration layer managing agent workflows across the operation, exception handling protocols that escalate to the right level of human intervention, integration logic connecting the tools and AP is the business depends on, and the progressive achievement of architectural certainty, the state where the system runs without requiring a human decision for days at a time. Each of these is a solved problem in the Arco stack. For an independent founder, each is an original problem, encountered for the first time, solved under the financial pressure of a burn rate that does not stop while the infrastructure is being built. We call this infrastructure drag. infrastructure drag is the 12 to 18 months a founder-led autonomous company spends on foundational work before it generates the first unit of revenue from a running autonomous loop. It is not optional. Every autonomous build requires this work. The question is whether the team solving it is doing so for the first time or the fifth, and whether the solutions they reach are tested against real operational failure data or theoretical best guesses. The rebuild tax we described in episode 4 is infrastructure drag paid retrospectively, the cost of having rushed the foundations in order to ship something, then returning to rebuild them correctly once the business is live. Infrastructure drag is the same cost, paid upfront. Either way, it is the price of starting at zero. The studio model is the alternative to starting at zero. What makes Arco's studio model structurally different from a traditional venture studio is not capital or shared office space or common legal templates. Traditional studios offer all of those. The structural differentiator is the Agentic Core. The Agentic Core is the modular code, workflow logic, and operational infrastructure shared across every Arco portfolio company. It is not a platform sold to the businesses. It is not a service the studio provides. It is the internal architecture that every Arco business runs on, and that every Arco business contributes to. Agent orchestration frameworks tested across multiple deployment environments. Exception handling protocols calibrated by real operational failure data. Data architecture templates designed for agentic execution from day one. Integration logic for the categories of tools and AP is common across Arco's target markets. Stewardship protocols refined through the experience of running previous businesses under the same model. Each new deployment adds to it. An edge case encountered in the first business becomes a handled exception in the second. A failure mode that was novel in the logistic deployment is a known quantity in the compliance deployment that follows. An agent architecture that reached architectural certainty in one market provides the reference model for the next market's build. The Agentic Core improves with every deployment, not as a side effect of running businesses, but as a designed output of the studio model. The compounding consequence is measurable at the build level. An independent founder starting an autonomous business in a proven market begins with a blank canvas. No tested orchestration layer, no calibrated exception logic, no reference architecture for stewardship, no operational data from a previous deployment to inform the current one. Arco's internal target is a 60% reduction in time to market for each successive business compared to an equivalent independent build. That figure is our internal benchmark, not an industry average, not a published study. It reflects the compounding value of solving the hardest infrastructure problems once, correctly, and applying those solutions to every subsequent market we enter. To make the compounding concrete, consider what the third Arco business inherited from the first two. The data architecture designed for the first business has been stress-tested against the operational demands of two live deployments. The exception handling protocols have been calibrated against real failure data from two distinct market contexts. The MTTI optimization approach, the methodology for extending how long the revenue loop runs without human intervention, has been tested, measured, and refined twice. The stewardship protocols have been implemented by a real operator in a real business, and the gaps in the initial design have been identified and filled. The third business does not start at the frontier of theory. It starts at the frontier of demonstrated operational practice. An independent founder building their first autonomous company in the same market starts with none of that. They start with the same tools, the same LLMs, the same APIs, the same orchestration frameworks. What they cannot replicate is the accumulated operational knowledge of building autonomous businesses across multiple markets. The tools are available to anyone. The institutional memory of what breaks, what holds, and what the architecture looks like when it reaches genuine architectural certainty. That is, the compounding asset the studio model produces and the founder-led model cannot. Traditional venture studios shared legal templates and introductions. Arco shares the logic that runs the business. That is a categorically different form of shared infrastructure, and it improves with every deployment in a way that the legal templates do not. The studio model changes what the human role in each Arco business actually is. In a founder-led company, the founder is the business. Their judgment navigates uncertainty. Their relationships open markets. Their ability to make the right call when the data is incomplete is the primary variable that determines whether the company survives its first 3 years. That is a high-variance dependency, and it produces high-variance outcomes. In an Arco business, the architecture navigates the uncertainty. The Agentic Core handles the operational logic. The market was selected because the demand is documented and the customer is already paying. The founder's primary function, discovering whether the business can work, has already been answered by the market selection process. What remains is stewardship, managing the system that runs the business rather than running the business yourself. The stewardship model is the operating principle that makes this possible. One experienced operator overseeing an agentic stack, handling the exceptions the system surfaces, improving the architecture over time, expanding agent authority in the tiers where the design has proven stable. Not executing tasks, not managing human workers, auditing and improving the system that executes on the business's behalf. We named this model in episode 2 and described what a steward's week looks like in episode 3. The studio model is what makes the stewardship role viable at the scale of a portfolio. Arco's performance target for every business is an MTTI, mean time to intervention, greater than 72 hours. The revenue loop runs for more than 3 days on average without requiring the steward to make a decision. That is the operational test of whether the Agentic Core is holding. It is also the test of whether the studio model has delivered what it promises. A business that runs on architecture, not on the continuous presence of a highly capable individual. The parallel to legacy liability from episode 6 is precise. A legacy incumbent cannot reform because the organization built around human coordination is also the organization that would need to authorize its own dismantling. A founder-led autonomous build accumulates its own version of structural debt in the first 18 months. Infrastructure built under time pressure, exception handling designed around the specific conditions of the first deployment, rather than generalized for what follows. Stewardship protocols that emerge from practice rather than from design. That debt is not as deep as a 30-year legacy firm's, but it compounds in the same direction, and it is paid at the same moment, when the business needs every resource for growth, not for reconstruction. What is the Arco studio model and how does it differ from a traditional venture studio? The Arco studio model is built on a shared agentic core. The modular code, workflow logic, and operational infrastructure reused across every portfolio company. Unlike traditional venture studios that provide capital and shared services, Arco provides a pre-built autonomous architecture that eliminates the 12 to 18 months of infrastructure drag. Every founder-led autonomous build must absorb. Each new business launches from the accumulated operational knowledge of every previous deployment, resolved failure patterns, calibrated exception handling, refined agent architectures. The human role in each business is stewardship. One operator overseeing the agentic stack and improving the system over time, rather than executing tasks. Arco's internal time to market target is a 60% reduction per successive business versus an equivalent independent build. Here is the verdict on the studio model. The venture studio concept is not new. What is new is the availability of agentic infrastructure that can be modularized, shared, and compounded across a portfolio of autonomous businesses. Traditional studios shared the inputs: capital, legal templates, investor introductions, office space. Those are useful. They are also interchangeable. A founder can source all of them independently. What Arco shares is not interchangeable: the operational logic that runs each business, tested across every previous deployment and improved by every edge case those deployments produced. Every new startup that attempts to build an autonomous business from scratch spends its first 12 to 18 months on infrastructure drag, foundational engineering that Arco has already built, tested, and refined across multiple live deployments. That time is not spent on revenue. It is the cost of starting at zero. The studio model removes that cost by ensuring that no Arco business ever starts at zero. Each one starts at the frontier of everything every previous build has learned. Legacy liability traps the incumbent because the organization built around human coordination is also the organization that would need to authorize its own dismantling. Infrastructure drag traps the independent founder because the foundational problems of autonomous architecture must be solved alone, once under financial pressure without a reference model. The studio model is the structural response to the second trap, as clean sheet design was the structural response to the first. The full written version of this argument is memo number 7, the case for the studio, on the blog at arcoventure.studio. Every concept introduced across this 7-episode arc is defined precisely in the Arco lexicon at arcoventure.studio/lexicon. Next week, building in public. Why Arco logs its operational decisions, what that transparency produces, and what it costs. We do not look for geniuses to run our companies. We build companies so well engineered that they do not need geniuses to run them. This has been episode 7 of the Operator Log.